All right, guys, welcome back to the chess openings series. And today, I'm pretty sure some of you guys heard of the big news in the chess scene in that Ding Liren won the first game against Gukesh in the World Chess Championship, and he won it using the French. So that inspired me to think up some French sidelines that I can show you. And we'll take a quick look at the opening that they played, and then I have excellent ideas which I've prepared for tournaments, and I got to use some of them, but not all of them. So I'd like to share them with you, especially in the sidelines. So I'd like to focus today on the Schlechter French. So let's take a look right now and see how their game went between Ding and Gukesh. So they had the Steinitz French with knight f6. And the main line here is knight f3, but Gukesh went for knight e2, which is a bit more rare and a bit more tricky because sometimes there are these ideas of f5 followed by knight f4, and this pawn tends to fall. And so in the French, if this pawn tends to fall and this pawn is gone, then e6 is coming, and it's really tough to stop all this bombardment by white. So it's a very tricky line, but let's see what Ding did against that. He said in the interview after the game he didn't really remember this line well, and he could have went for a normal move like bishop e7 and castle, which is main line, or he could improvise. And he decided to improvise. He did a pretty good job of improvising with a5 here because after a4 and queen a5, g4 queen a5, he was already equal. So g4 is maybe not the most correct, but it's a way to play. The line I would recommend against g4 is not even queen a5, which is okay, but b5. And so we get this complete mess on the board. So their pawns are coming at us and we're coming at them. I'm guessing the reason why Dink didn't want to go for b5 is it looks like it's very principled. And I'm pretty sure that Gukesh was looking at this sometime before the match, and he would have known some lines with knight g3. So just to give you an example of what could have happened is knight g3, bishop a6. And then the critical part is, can white stop this attack with b4? Because if white does nothing, then there will come a3 followed by b4, and this opens up, the center is collapsing, right? But if white manages to play a3, then black can apparently castle and ignore these scary pawns coming at them, because even though they may be a little bit menacing, we always have f6. And in some lines, it turns out that the pawn on g4 is actually hurting white, because usually they would have this sacrifice with like h4, bishop h7, but here they don't, because the queen's way is blocked, so the Greek gift does not work on h7. And by the time you play f5, we'll already have b4 in. Okay, so we're going to trade off that scary bishop, and without the scary bishop, the attack is basically over, or at least it's much less scary. So if you have to play something like that, we can already look into f6 and blow open the file. And if you try to take earlier on, so if we go for b5 and takes, then the point is that knight takes c5, and the knight is coming into the delicious square. White needs to retain control over d4, right? They need to keep that square. But if they stick the knight on d4, then we take, and just ignore them. We say, you want my pawn, you can have the pawn, but my knight is going to be so happy on e4. Your king is not going to be happy about this premature g4, right? That's not really in his favor anymore. And we get to trade off the French bishop. If we get to trade the French bishop, the other bishop is actually very good, and their bishop turns out to be bad in many endgames, right? Our knight is superb, and we have the two open files to do whatever we want. And the a pawn is actually quite annoying, because if you ever try to play b3, I can stick it there and get a nail pawn for the end game, okay, with knight c3 coming one day. So this is where Dean could have been happy, okay, if he played for b5. Instead, he went for queen a5 later on. So he decided on queen a5 against g4 and got a3 takes and b4, where Gukesh was actually a little bit better. So white had an advantage out of the opening. But on the bright side, in the French, what I want to tell you is that it's a very counterattacking opening. So even though, yes, They have some scary pawns. Yes, they have the center. We also have something too. We always have counterplay. We can bite on the backward pawn. The backward pawn on a2 could be a problem. Later on, we got some squares, like Ding managed to stick the knight all the way to b2 and get the free pawns, and that allowed him to later win the game. Okay. Now, I'm not going to focus on the game. There's excellent coverage from other people on the game, but I do want to show you how to play against the French sidelines, because when my students play the French, they always complain about, Mike, what do I do against the King's Indian attack and against the Schlechter? And that's what I want to show you today. So the first thing I want to show is that the Schlechter, which is bishop d3 against the French, is not very scary. Okay, let's figure out why not. In the Wiener Schlechter, which starts with knight c3 bishop before, then bishop d3, we have this idea of takes, knight f6, kick the bishop. Usually he goes back to say our bishop is bad, and then this move e5, which is also very strong, even in this version. So then after takes, if they take with the king, we can simply play knight g4. And if they don't want to get forked, they have to give us the bishop pair, and black should be happy here. Okay, of course, the line continues, but it's a perfectly playable position for black. So that's why I want to show you my idea against the Schlechter. As far as I know, it hasn't been played much in tournament chess. I played one game here, which I'm going to show. I was playing in Dieppe Open in France, and I got to use it on a slightly weaker player, but I think it shows the capacity and the potential for this line. So what happened in our game was I took, Mr. Pascal took back, and I kicked away his bishop. The bishop ran away, and c5. Okay, e5 doesn't work right away. But c5 first is an improvement. So the point is, if they play c3, we can isolate their pawn. We're very happy. So almost everybody will play knight e2, trying to get the knight there. That is the main line. Okay, and instead of taking and going into all these variations with knight c6, which are long and arduous, I don't want to compete with them as to who has a longer memory and a better memory. I want to show them a new idea, such as e5. Okay, this hasn't been played much, but the engine loves it. My Leela is a big fan, for example. And the whole point is, after they take, well, they can't push because, that's how you get your bishop trapped. And if you don't want to push, then you have to take. But after you take, we go into this endgame. So they have to take back. I go for knight g4, and this endgame is basically forced. You have to be playing, you have to be okay with playing these queenless middle games, but it's a good version, right? It's a good version for black because, yes, they're up a pawn, but I have the bishop pair. Their king is bad. We get the open file. We got decent control over the center, and this pawn turns out to be weak in many cases. So all in all, this is enough compensation for equality. Okay, and that's why I call this the refutation of the Schlechter. When I call my videos refutations, I don't mean that we're winning as black. I mean that we can show that this line is not scary against the French. Okay, let's take a look at why. So, of course, f3 is logical, right? They want to kick away the bishop, and they can try many things here. So let's take a look at some of them. In the game, he actually went for knight a3, which is a bit surprising. I guess they're trying to develop this way, but yes, the knight can go here and protect the pawn. It's interesting. But after knight c6, I equalized quite easily because my king castles long. The king could have gone in the other direction too, and we would have just as much fun because the bishop is really great here, dominating that knight. The pawn is weak, the knight is tied down. And after takes, a rook check, knight d4, we win at least our pawn back. Okay, let's say they play here, then we steal the pawn and run back. In the actual game, he tried to defend the pawns the other way. So Pascal tried to run away with king c1, but after bishop e7, we have g5 in the air sometimes, but also we're trying to bring in the rook to gobble back our pawn. If we get the pawn back, then we have the pawn and the compensation, right? That is, we won our pawn back and we still have the compensation. So knight c4, they're trying to hold on to the pawn, but now g5 makes perfect sense. Okay. And we get to look at their pawn. They try to support the pawn with bishop c3, but I get to kick away the pieces from here too. We're better developed, so we can get away with weakening moves like b5. Okay, he tries to chase back my bishop. He tries to make way for his own bishop, make a little window, but I just swing back my bishop to win back my pawn. Okay, he doesn't have knight f6 because the knight is pinned to the pawn here, right? So f4, I kick away that knight. He has to run back. We win his supporting pawn, or at least we trade it off. And this is very loose, right? I could take the pawn right away, but I have something even better in bishop h6. I win my pawn back now. And we go for opposite color bishops. It turns out that their rooks never really connected, and we got all the rooks coming in on the second rank, right? So rook e2 coming, and there is no way to stop it. So Pascal resigned. You can say it's a bit premature, but try defending this pawn. You'll have a very hard time with moves like rook a2. Okay, so it's basically losing already. Now, if we go back to the start, okay, the critical position is actually this one right here. Okay, so there are a few things white can try in this Schlechter. One of them is knight g3, right? Very reasonable. But what I want to show you here is that we're not scared of that knight and he cannot hurt us. Okay, so they can connect the pawns, but then we're happy to push the h pawn and we have a blockade on the light squares. Um, let's say they play f5, right? Isn't that why they went for this in the first place? To kick away our bishop, right? To lock him in. But they can never take our pawn because we'll take back our f pawn here and then open up the rook. Okay, so we're not scared of that at all. And we're threatening h4, right? Maybe they want to block us with h4 themselves, but then we start asking questions about those pawns, right? They can't hold on to all these pawns because we have 97 coming, and the bishop will get out. Our bishop pair will have its revenge on their king and on those light squares. Okay, they can't hold on to the pawns. Castling is coming, and black is already better. Not just equal, down a pawn, but better. Okay, so what else can they do? It's not so easy. They can kick us away with h4. So let's go to this position. They can try h4 right now. But then we just make a little window, and this bishop is fantastic where he is right now, right? Even when he's on h7, he has a great diagonal. Knight d4 is in the air. They have to watch out. And after we check, we don't want to play knight d4 right away because they can play knight e4 to stop us, but it's always looming, right? We develop our pieces first, and at this point, they kind of have to throw away the pawn because if they don't, then I will take it for myself. So they try to throw away the pawn, and I'm not even interested. I'm not gonna take and give myself a bad pawn. I'm coming for their pawns. Okay. So we take the pawn on c2, and already black is totally fine here, right? This pawn is ours for the taking, and the bishop pair will reign supreme. Okay. So that's why knight g3 is not really a scary move here because it doesn't fully defend the pawn. They can try to defend the pawn with bishop f4, but after knight c6, castle long, we chase the king away and we come after that pawn, right? We're gonna get the pawn on e5, and the bishop can choose whether to run here or the other way. Usually both ways are fine. Okay, so just to show you in this line, we want our pawn back, and if they try to hold on to it this way, we will ask them nicely again to get away from the pawn and give it back to us, right? And when our bishop pair will come out as well, right? And if they try to be stubborn and they're saying that bishop g3 can always defend their pawn, then we simply win the pawn. And their rook connection that's lacking for white is going to haunt them in the end. Because their rooks are not connected, they cannot defend the pawn properly. Okay, so that's another example for you. And They can try to stick the knight on e4 and get their king to safety, but we win back our pawn. This is maybe the best they have, and here I will also equalize comfortably and win back the pawn. All right, and that's the best they have, is to give us the pawn back. So we call it a gambit, but is it really a gambit if they can't defend the pawn in the long run? So we're having all the fun attacking them, getting the files, and using our bishop pair. Okay, so that's what I want to show you, is that the French is not a defensive opening. It can be played to attack as well. And in support of this thesis, I'd like to show you two more lines that I think you will enjoy. Okay, so let's say we're playing the French against the King's Indian attack. Okay, so d3 or queen e2. Against queen e2, there are many tries as well. There is even this gambit where you give up the pawns and let them have pawn, and they can even grab another pawn. And even this is playable down 2 pawns because we get to have all this compensation. But it's not to everybody's style. So if you want something calmer, there is knight f6 or there is b6 going for a hedgehog structure, right? So we can play it like a hedgehog in the Sicilian. But let's say they play it in the d3 move order. This is the one I'm most interested in and the more popular one. Okay, they play it like a King's Indian attack. They're going for g3, bishop g2, and knight f3. A lot of these sidelines can be met with knight c6. Okay, in the French, this move is highly underappreciated. And you know, Richard Rapport, who's helping Ding Liren right now for the World Championship, is a big proponent of these ideas with knight c6, as I'll show you soon. The point here is we're not gonna try and play knight f6 and play it defensively. No, not at all. We're playing for the attack. Let's go. We're hitting them with g5. Okay, and the next point is that after h3, our queen comes to f6. We're going to castle long. Again, in the French, very often you want to castle long, especially if they can't hurt you on c8 or b8. All right. Castling short can actually get you in more danger in the French because of the bishop coming to d3 one day, right? So here we go for the attack right away. And the great point about this move is not only are we stopping the pawn from coming here, we're defending this pawn, right? We are defending the rook, we're defending this pawn, and we're preparing the attack against that knight. Because yes, we can even play h5 right now, right away. Okay. The point is, if they kick us, the queen will come here, the knight can come out, the bishop comes here, and we castle long. g4 is coming very soon because we are hitting that pawn, right? So they can try to defend it with knight b3, but we can keep attacking. Also, we have g4 right away, okay? And the point of g4 is if they take, we trade off that rook, so they can't castle short either. And then their knight is behind enemy lines. Okay, so we kind of trapped him here, and this is unclear because the knight's kind of in trouble. We have easy development. Knight is coming to f5. Yes, I mean, this pawn can be weak, but we have ways to support it and easy play, right? We can strike down the center with f6, and it's not so easy for them to defend, right? So this whole idea of g5 is super interesting. I tried it in some tournament games with good results, and it's hard for white to really refute it, right? The engine likes it. If you put this on Leela, it was giving me 0.2 or something like that, which is very acceptable when you're playing for white, for black, I should say. Okay, so after queen f6, what else can they do? They can try for c3, and then I'm going to develop my bishop, and here comes the attack again, right? One of the scariest things they can do is this check over here, but even there, we have ways to play against it. We have g4 coming in, kicking away the knight, and then we just hide. The queen often comes to g7 in these lines, right? And once our bishop is on c6, if they take the pawn on g4, I can win the pawn on e5. So this pawn turns out to be really weak. Our knight is coming to g6, and we're castling long, okay? That's the basic idea. I should tell you that it's a bit tough to play this. You have to be very accurate if you're playing g5, g4, right, at the start. I would say analyze this for yourself. Try to come up with your own file. But as an idea, this is really great. So just to finish off the line, we develop, we give up the bishop pair, and we can just go back. And even though, yes, we're slightly worse, yes, they have the bishop pair, we're fairly sound. They have a hard time getting out of this pin as well. So we can be satisfied with the opening, okay? And you'll find it surprising how many people will panic against this move, right? Because how can we do that as black? If they play here, for example, we're already doing great. So if they just follow the setup they usually go for, they can get in trouble too. Okay, we have f5, then the queen comes out, this knight is out of play, and black is better. Okay, after something like this. All right, so that's one idea of g5 and the king's Indian attack. And finally, I'll finish with the b3 gambit against the French, so the wing gambit, which is b3 on move 2. Okay, there are many ways to play against it, of course, and all of them are perfectly fine. I've seen bishop e7 before. That's one idea. Some people even play a5. I mean, you can play almost anything, including the main lines. The old main line used to be knight f6 here, because if you take, it's a slightly annoying gambit where they can castle long and play g4. That's their idea. So we're not playing that game. We're not going into their hands. Instead, we're going to try something else, which is knight c6. So this was an idea of that Richard Rapport liked to play a lot. I don't know who started this idea, but it worked out really well for him. So here he's playing a 2460 player, decent player, and the 2460 guy goes for bishop b5, and Richard says, let's just take the pawn and attack this guy. Okay, turns out that g2 is really weak. I was going to suggest knight e7 because this just gets you the bishop pair for no reason, right? And if they follow their usual setup, we ask them about their bishop, who is short on squares, right? They have to give us the bishop pair, and then we can go for d4, blocking the other bishop, okay? In the actual game, he played for queen g5, and black won anyways. But I want to show you the other choice. What else can white do right now? Okay, it's not so easy to play for white, because if they play this like a French exchange, well, that's a pathetic French exchange, right? At some point, they have to get the center. They can't play without it, okay? So if they try to play it without d4, then we will get the center, okay? We can scare them with a5, a4. They try to block us, and then c5, d4 is coming, okay? And let's say they just take out their pieces. I stick the pawn here. They lost all their bishops effectively. And now my knight is coming to greener pastures. Okay. c3, the point is that this pawn will be weak and my knight gets a tempo into his root on d5 and f4. Okay. So that brings us to the other tries. What else can they do? Well, they can push. So I will recommend this move d4, cutting the pawn from his friend. Okay, and what's going on here? Well, knight f3 is the most natural, right? Trying to defend the pawn. F4 is not very ambitious either. Okay, so let's say we want to win the pawn. We can actually win the pawn with queen d5, and we play queen e4 check, then win the pawn on e5. It's a bit risky. I will tell you that you can get hurt with your queen on e4 and d5 like this. So I'm actually going to show a different idea. I'm going to say we don't have to be greedy. We can just play for knight e7 instead, okay? And the point is we can fianchetto our French bishop, quote unquote, who becomes very powerful indeed. On top of that, when this pawn is split from his friends, we can push our pawn all the way. And if they take, we stick the queen on d3, which is super annoying, right? Our bishop is coming out, king is castling long, knight is coming to f5, and we have very easy development. If they don't take that pawn, they don't have to, of course, but then we get the bishop to b7 anyways. And if they play for c4, knight's coming to f5, Pawns coming to h5 to make sure we get the outpost and scare them with h4, h3. All right, and then we can wake up the bishop or simply castle. Okay, so for example here, knight e4, castle long, and black is doing great. Okay, the control of the file, all the pieces are coming out, and we're gonna slowly start to undermine their center. We also have a lot of good squares like knight b4, knight d4. So we have a lot to play for here, and black is basically equal. Okay, so hope that helps you play the French sidelines and play the French as a whole. Remember, it can be played for the attack. It's not just a defensive weapon.